let's bring one of the most important and critical topics into our conversation today, which related to the issue of migration. Now, again, if you follow the news that today, when we look at this division in the West, particularly on the issue of illegal immigrants or the issue on migration, is standing in the crossroads. But here's the question we need to ask. How much do we actually understand regarding the concept of migration? And also, when we look at the term illegal immigrants, do we really understand the term in a correct way? Or that we think the whole world should redefine those critical terminologies in order to understand the truth? Well, in this episode, we are going to address all of them. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Professor Hein De Haas. Again, Professor De Haas is a sociologist and a geographer who has lived and worked in the Netherlands, Morocco, and the United Kingdom. He's currently the professor of sociology at the University of Amsterdam. Of course, this is his amazing book. It's called How Migration Really Works, a Factual Guide to the Most Divisive Issue in Politics. Well, Professor De Haas, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Well, Professor, I want to get started. Again, as we mentioned before, when we talk about the issue regarding migration, it's not just the West. Around the world, it's one of the most critical issues that on this agenda. Now, let's go to your book. Let's get started with the term called invasion. I want to read something to you. You, an expert, can help us with a better understanding. This is what you wrote, and I quote, "In the United States, too, politicians and pundits have frequently invoked the term invasion, while media images and political rhetoric about migrant caravans fuel fears about a massive third world exodus often portrayed as attack on the sovereignty." Now, Professor, help us with better understanding. How much do you think today that we completely misunderstand the term migration? And of course, why do you think the media today and also the political rhetoric tend to exaggerate such issue? How much do they actually misunderstand? Your thoughts?
Well, I'm not sure whether politicians misunderstand it. I think they hijacked the migration issue to win elections. That is where it comes down to. Because fear is a very powerful instrument to gain political power and to gain political support. So what is happening? It's what's happening on the border of several countries. I mean, these problems are real, but it is hugely exaggerated in terms of the overall scale of it. So we get the impression, for instance, in the US, but also in Europe and other parts of the world, that most migrants these days are illegal migrants. They try to cross those borders with boats or in caravans, whereas this is only a tiny fraction of total migration. And if you even further zoom out, if you get this impression that the whole world is on the move and that migration is totally running out of hand. But just if you look at the facts, a much more sobering picture appears. Around 3% of the world population is an international migrant, actually much lower than many people would think. And that percentage has remained remarkably stable over the last half a century. Now, if you look at illegal migration, in Europe, for instance, you never know exactly, of course, how many people cross borders illegally, but the best estimates range from 50 to 100,000, for instance, to Europe. Whereas the total legal inflow into the European Union is between 2 and 2.5 million. So it puts things into perspective. So immigration is real. We have increasing migration in all rich countries in the world, which has more to do with labor shortages, aging, economic growth, attracting migrants to work, but a large majority of migrants are actually legal. And as far as there is illegal migration, it is predominantly about, again, people who want jobs. You look at the United States has a record number of vacancies. The unemployment is on a record low since 50 years. There's a huge demand for labor. There is not enough legal ways to migrate, so some people take the illegal route. So that is to sketch the picture. And of course, politicians use those images to blow totally out of proportion the true scale of illegal migration. Of course, that's a real problem, but it's sort of exaggerated to an extent that it almost seems like politicians have a benefit from this framing. So people really think we are being invaded, so they can position themselves as strong leaders. But these are the same politicians that tolerate migrants doing all sorts of jobs, even migrants without papers, because they are not really willing to interfere. So there's a huge political hypocrisy around the issue in almost any rich country in the world.
Professor, I want to go back to the fundamental question. Again, at the beginning of the book, I have to say, the more I read about it, and it was so enlightening, and of course, it was even educational on many purposes. But Professor, go back to the term. I know in the book you mentioned, too often, particularly if we look at the West, we tend to coin the term illegal immigrants. But however, in your book, that's something, it's not really the case. So in other words, there's a type of misunderstanding regarding the term illegal immigrants. So help us with better understanding what is wrong with the term. I mean, are we actually distorting the meaning of the terms when we pull in the political or this economic sense? What are your thoughts?
I mean, there is a phenomenon called illegal migration, which means people crossing the border without having permission. But the label is tagged to way too many people. Think about refugees, for example. It is within the International Refugee Convention, which is adopted by the vast majority of nations in the world, a human right to cross a border to seek protection. What you see in the media is that many asylum seekers that cross borders to seek protection are being labeled as illegal migrants, which is fundamentally wrong in the first place. In the second place, I think it is a bit tricky to attach this to individual persons, because when we can talk about a phenomenon called illegal migration, I don't have that many problems with. But if you attach to a person, you basically suggest that that person is a criminal. And we just know that in many countries, I've just mentioned it, in the United States, a massive amount of undocumented migrants do all sorts of work, and they pay taxes, and often they are actually just living in those countries for years and years and years, basically accepted. So politicians tolerate that many migrants do all sorts of jobs, even if they don't have residency papers. So it becomes really problematic to tag populations that have been living, for instance, in the United States or in Europe, but also in East Asian countries like Japan and Korea for many years, even if they have no documents, to still say they're illegal. But in practice, they're accepted. So that shows the difficulty of just tagging that label. And I think particularly with refugees, it is really problematic, because it is actually a human right to seek protection.
Professor, I want to go back to one of the stories that you documented in the book, and you mentioned that back in 2015, you moved back to the Netherlands after having spent 10 years researching and teaching migration at the University of Oxford. And then you came into this event. I guess that's where the question was asked. You know, when the journalist asked the audience for a show of hands, who is with you? And so in other words, pro-immigration, and who is anti-immigration? Again, Professor, I am a journalist. I have to say that, to be honest, not all the journalists are wise enough or smart enough to understand the deeper meaning as you document in the book. Now, why do you think today, when we look at the issue of immigration, we really have to pick the side? Either you are pro or you are against it. What is happening today to the debate? And even according to, you mentioned the media, the academia, the politics, and the economy, everything, it's centered on the black and white issue. Is this really a black and white issue, as the journalist mentioned? Go ahead.
No, it is not, because that was for me a key moment, because that's actually the moment I decided to write a book and to start to think about, I need to write a book, because a book for the general public, not for academics, because I think the debate has become so polarized, but because what you're describing is this polarization, and that is not a serious way to discuss migration. Nobody would ask an economist, are you in favor or against the economy? Or are you in favor or against markets? Because markets are just there. The question is, how do we regulate them? As long as human beings have been around, there has been trade, right? So the question is, of course, how do we deal with it? It's the same with migration. It's there. When you listen to some politicians, it seems like they want to wish it away. And they want to wish something away that is a fundamental part of our society, that to a large extent is inevitable. Now, if you wish something away, you're never going to have policies that successfully regulate things. So the paradox is, by accepting a reality on the ground and understanding why migration happens, you can actually develop better policies. So the polarization of the debate means that the nuance is basically out of the window, because pro-migration people will only emphasize how wonderful migration is. Anti-migration people will equate immigration to an invasion and this ultimate threat. But what both are doing are usually exaggerating the impacts of migration, whether positive or negative. And what gets lost is the nuance and the evidence. So that is the paradox. You would think that a hotly debated topic we have a lot of knowledge about, but actually that pro-anti frame pushes all the knowledge away and leads to all this cherry picking, people only taking facts that they like and forgetting all the others. And what gets lost is the nuance. And that is why I decided to write the book, because I think it is no longer acceptable that politicians get away with all these lies about migration. I also hope journalists, of course, will read my book so that they can question politicians more critically, because I know journalists don't have much time and I cannot blame journalists for that. But I really also hope that journalists find this book useful. Next time they talk to a politician, they're going to ask, because a lot of migration politics is only about wishful thinking. I'm going to close the border. But the right question is, how are you going to do that? And why have the policies that over the last 30 years to stop migration failed? These are the right questions. Because politicians will keep on repeating the same failed policy solutions if that makes them win an election. They're in for the short term. Nobody's going to question them in 20 years, has your policy failed or not? But what we know from the record of the last 30 years of sort of migration policies is that politicians have not succeeded in achieving their policy goals. So something's wrong. So even if you are, let's say, against immigration, you should be interested in the evidence, I guess, about what policies work and what policies don't work. But unfortunately, we rarely see those debates. And that is because when there is an economic crisis, you have a serious debate, right? Do we need to increase government spending? Do we need to decrease government spending? Do we need to push up the interest rate or not? I never hear these discussions about migration.
Professor, I promise you, as a journalist myself, I have already shared your amazing book with all my friends who are also in the media field, because again, as you mentioned before, as journalists, and we cannot just only listen to the political pundits and also listen to the political sound bites, especially for the campaign purposes. Now, let's keep our conversation going. Again, going back to the book, you mentioned quite a good amount of numbers regarding this great migration happened between 1914 and 1970. Now, let's talk about this. You mentioned, and I quote, approximately 6 million African Americans moved to the northern industrial cities as part of the Great Migration between 1940 and 1970 in the hope of finding better economic opportunities and escaping racism in the South. Now, help us with better understanding as we're looking at the migration today. How much do we still need to understand that people are actually seeking better economic opportunities and also escaping some of the suppressions in some of the countries? What are your thoughts on that? And why do you think it's critical for us to continue to refer to the history in order to understand the modernity? Your thoughts, Professor?
I think that migration, that huge migration within the United States is replicated now on an international level in many ways. And what many people tend to forget, migration is either represented, I'm talking about these big South-North type of migrations of poorer people to richer countries, or within countries like in the past in the US. It's often represented as this desperate fight for misery caused by poverty and inequality and warfare. It creates this idea, it's all about problems in the global South. Or it is represented as this invasion, right? On the left, you more have the narrative about desperation. On the right, there's more the narrative about the invasion. But what gets systematically ignored is that, and I call this the elephant in the room of the migration debate, is that without real opportunities in destination countries, the vast majority of migrants wouldn't have come. With the only exception of refugees, but that's only 10% of total migration in the world. So we really talk about the bulk of migration is people seeking for better opportunities. And this is not some crazy dream. We just know that if the economy does well, immigration goes up. If the economy does bad and unemployment goes up, many migrants either go back and not many migrants will come. And that's why I often say the best way to really reduce migration is to wreck the economy. But that's what nobody wants. So the point is that we have these huge labor shortages in many sectors, and those attract migrants. So it is not just about people fleeing situations of desperation or poverty. In addition, it takes a lot of money and resources to migrate. So we also know that the poorest of the poorest often cannot make it. And it's typically the middle-income countries, like, the famous example of Mexico in the United States, or Turkey in Europe, or the Philippines nowadays in Asia. These are not the poorest countries in the world, because you need some money and resources. So migration is an investment in a better future. It is not a desperate act of flight or this invasion. People look for opportunities, and the reality is those opportunities are there, and we allow migrants to do that work. I was shocked when I found out the number of employers in the United States, for instance, or in the UK, that get prosecuted on a yearly basis for employing undocumented migrants. Somewhere between 10 and 20 per year, without any zeros added. And that shows to me it's like the smoking gun that's behind all the tough rhetorics of politicians. They tolerate this happening. So this is what the public needs to know, that politicians basically are deceiving the public with all these tough rhetorics and all this talk about building of walls and fences, that in reality they tolerate that migrants work because the jobs are there, and in a way they needed to be filled, because otherwise our economies wouldn't do as well as they do.
Professor, I want to, again, going back to the book, when we talk about migration, you mentioned the word called diversity, and you dedicated a good chapter as a title called "Diversity is no threat to social cohesion and national identity." And again, I want to read that what you wrote. It often goes along with national ideologies that do not see ethnic, religious, and local and hypernated identities as incompatible with belonging to a nation that supersedes such identities. Now, Professor, what is the correlation, or what is the relationship when we talk about migration and diversity? And also, of course, that you said it's no threat to the social cohesion and national identity. What is the explanation or the complication behind that?
First of all, it's often said that immigration threatens the social and ethnic cohesion of destination societies. The first bit of evidence is the studies that have tried statistically to see, is there a real relation between levels of immigration and social trust and social cohesion in nations and communities. And different studies find different things, but you don't find a very clear result. It's very ambiguous. So you cannot really say that the main cause behind declining social trust in some countries is immigration. So migration is at best a minor factor. In some cases it can increase, in some cases decrease, but there's no clear case. There are very diverse countries with very socially cohesive societies. There are also very homogeneous societies with a lot of political problems. Well, the point is that I think we've become blind for diversity of the past. I think the United States is a great example. If you go back a century ago, many groups in the United States, for instance, Germans or Catholic immigrants or Italian immigrants in particular, and the Irish, but also Jewish immigrants and Asian immigrants, if you think about the Chinese and Japanese, were seen as a fundamental threat to the American society. And of course, in the 60s, 70s, it were the Latinos. So you see that in many countries, but after 2 or 3 generations, nobody can imagine those groups not being part of the American nation. When John F. Kennedy was elected president, it was a big issue with Roman Catholic, for instance. And nowadays we have many Chinese origin, Latino origin politicians in the American mainstream. And nobody would contest their Americanness anymore. And so we become blind to the diversity in the past because those groups have been absorbed into the society. And that's why we think of the past as super homogeneous. So even countries who see themselves as ethnically very homogeneous, like the Germans or the Japanese, their history, if you look deeper, is much more diverse than the ideology wants to tell us. And that actually shows that societies have an extraordinary capacity to absorb immigrants, on the condition, of course, that they allow them to absorb into the mainstream, because otherwise you get segregation. And that is the big danger of nationalist ideologies. They don't create that space to develop this hyphenated identity, because it's often like a transition towards full assimilation later. And I think the American experience and also the British experience shows how well that can go. I think ethno-states like Germany, but also my own country, the Netherlands, or Japan or Korea, have much more difficulties accepting that reality. But I think the experience of other countries shows it is actually possible.
Two more questions before letting you go, Professor. Let's talk about this general sense that when we look at the world's population, and of course today you mentioned several significant countries, for example, Asia, South Korea, Japan, and etc. But in reality, those countries today, and including the US, are also facing the crisis and the challenges of a population decline. I mean, again, we're looking at this political and social economic pressure upon each one of them, especially the younger generations. But in order for the country to continue to prosper and to be successful, we need resources. And of course, we need international talents. So according to your study, according to your book, Professor, do you think that when we talk about international migration or international talents, these people are actually making significant changes upon the countries that we mentioned above, especially when we are looking at the population crisis? So in other words, it's not just about saving the country, it's more about making the contribution in a significant way. And what do you say to that?
Yeah, so migration is not a solution to aging. We know that from research, because we would need such huge numbers of migrants to counteract the effect of aging, and migrants are aging themselves, and origin countries of migrants are also starting to age. So that is a pro-migration myth, I think. But having said that, of course, aging in combination with economic growth in the future is going to lead to increasing labor shortages, particularly in the care sector, because it has a double effect. The older we get, the sicker we get, and the more help we need. Who's going to do that work? Less native workers want to do that work, because the native workforce is so highly skilled that most people would forgo those jobs. Plus, a real shortage will appear as well. But I think another factor is that the whole world is starting to age. There is no country left in the world where birth rates are not declining. Although in many poor countries in South Asia and in Sub-Saharan Africa, there will still be this potential for 1 or 2 generations to go. The number of countries that will start to compete for skilled and lower skilled workers will increase. So perhaps in the future, the question may no longer be, how do we stop them from coming, but how do we get them? And I think we already can see a labor crunch in many, many sectors, not only for the highest skilled, not only for the engineers and the doctors, but even in what I would call mid-skills. Think about nurses, for instance. It is becoming an increasingly competitive market internationally. So I think aging will definitely, in combination with growth, of course, if our economies collapse, the whole picture will look differently. But assuming some level of stability and growth, aging will for sure increase labor shortages even more in the future. And I don't think politicians are ready to accept that reality. Although migration cannot solve the problem, it will certainly increase the demand for migrant workers.
Professor, I want to ask you the last question. Again, going back to the title of your book, How Migration Really Works, a Factual Guide to the Most Divisive Issue in Politics. Let's just say for anyone, again, as you mentioned before, including journalists, that should all read this book in order to understand the factual information on migration, and instead of listening to the political pundits or the politicians or etc. So what would you expect the readers to understand when they finish reading the last chapter of your book? What are your expectations in a general sense? Your final thoughts?
Well, what are my hopes, I could say, is that it doesn't matter what political color you are. I mean, I didn't write the book as an ideological sort of book. I really want any reader, independent of their political preferences, to be much more critical towards what politicians say about immigration, and to be more aware that politicians make all sorts of claims that are simply not true, both on the left and on the right side, and use migration as an issue to win the elections or defend their own interests. But also to understand that we cannot think or wish away migration, that we also need to look at migration like we look at other aspects of our society. And if we want to solve problems, we rather look at the evidence instead of believing cheap rhetorics. So I really hope it will help readers to look through the smokescreen that is being created by politicians. And to me, having done all the background research for 3 years on my book, I came to the conclusion there's no other word to characterize what's happening as propaganda. There is so much propaganda about migration. And I really hope that readers will, it will open their eyes for the reality, and that will also help them to be much more critical towards politicians, both on the left and the right, and pundits, about whatever they say about migration. And I hope the same for journalists, because journalists fulfill such an important task in our society in terms of fact-checking and asking the right questions. And also think about, okay, whatever I want, more, less, different migration, what policy works? And why have all these policies, the same policies that have been advocated for the last 30 years, why have they actually failed? These are the real questions to be asked. And what policies to put in place to regulate migration more effectively?
Well, Professor, I'm not going to argue against what you just said, because all those questions you propose and also you mentioned are really the questions that as a journalist that we should ask when it comes to migration, when it comes to the hot topic. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Professor Hein De Haas. Again, Professor De Haas is a sociologist and also a geographer who has lived and worked in many countries, and he's currently a professor of sociology at the University of Amsterdam. I strongly encourage everyone go online and check out this amazing book, which is entitled How Migration Really Works, a factual guide to the most divisive issue in politics. Well, Professor, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to discuss the issue on migration and also relevant topics. So thank you so much for your time.